Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. Today we're going to be talking all about Wix Router, which you can think of as super dynamic pages with hardcore dev capabilities that you can't get using the regular Wix dynamic pages. These pages essentially allow you to control everything that happens between the request for a specific URL and the response that you send to the user, adding in your own custom logic, which can help you control permissions and data flow to these individual pages. So if you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do to get started with routers, as with many of our tutorials, is to go ahead and turn on dev mode up here. So let's go ahead and turn on dev mode, and Wix will set up kind of the development environment, the IDE, and most importantly for us at the moment, this side panel where we can see kind of a menu with all the pages and the page code. So to add in our router page, what we're going to do is we're going to go up here to where it says main pages, and then we're going to click here, add router. And once I go ahead and add in the router, then we'll be able to give a URL prefix for this router page, and that's essentially the URL from which we'll navigate to all the sub pages of our router, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. But for now, I'm just going to call this Pokemon, and that has to do with the demo that I'm going to be showing you in a moment. So this is going to be my Pokemon router, and I'm going to go ahead and click over here, add and edit code. And now you can see that over here in the side panel, we've added in our router pages, and one page that's listed over here is the Pokemon page. So now that I've added in the router, beyond what we see right over here, which is the page code for this new Pokemon page, which is just one of the pages within this Pokemon router, we also have a new backend file which has been added, which is this routers.js file. Okay, and here we have some boilerplate code from Wix, and automatically every time we add in a new router, it will add in two functions. So one function is this function over here, so Pokemon router with the request, and the other one is this one with the sitemap, and this is going to be used for the SEO of this specific router. Obviously, the name of this function will change based on the router that you add. So if you called your router something else, it won't be called Pokemon, it'll be called whatever you called it. And Wix kind of puts this here and populates it with some default data as an example of how routers work. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of all these samples that we have here and just bring it to the very bare minimum state of what we need to work with inside of the router. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of all the code here within these functions. So now that I've gone ahead and I've cleared out all the code, essentially what we can do inside of the router function is to create our own custom logic for how we want Wix to handle requests that come into the specific URL that we defined, which is /Pokemon. So anytime somebody navigates to our website domain /Pokemon, it will run whatever code I put here and then determine how it wants to handle it based on who's making the request and what type of device they're using, etc. And I can return either certain data or specific pages of my router depending on the situation. With regard to the sitemap function, this determines how we want to handle the SEO of the pages that we're creating with the router. Because these routers are dynamic, essentially, you can think of them a little bit like dynamic pages if you're familiar with it. So we essentially have the ability to use this template to create multiple pages on our website. So for example, /Pokemon/ Charizard, I think there's a Pokemon. And we can have also /Pokemon/ Bulbasaur, and etc. And these are each individual pages on our website, and they need to have their own SEO logic, and that's essentially what we're going to be doing inside of the sitemap function. So before we head into the router.js file in the backend and we start writing out our logic, first I want to set up our individual router pages. And as I mentioned before, the router can have multiple pages that are nested under it. So if you take a look over here under router pages, at the moment it came with the default page. And for my current project, which is to create some kind of like Pokemon directory using the Pokemon API, so for this Pokemon page, what I'm going to do is I'm going to display an individual Pokemon's information. But within my router, I also want to have two additional pages. One page is going to be used to display a list of multiple Pokemon, and the other page is going to be used to display an option for people to create their own Pokemon if the Pokemon that they were searching for doesn't exist or something along those lines. So kind of like instead of a 404 page, it'll be like a create your own Pokemon page. So to add an additional page to our router, all we need to do is click over here on these three dots and click Add Page to Router. And now what we can do here is give a name to the router. So I'm going to use the same naming convention that we had before, and I'll call this the All Pokemon page. And I'm going to go ahead and add page. And it's important to note that this doesn't change the URL for navigating to the router. So all of the navigation to this router is done by /Pokemon. And I think it'll be a lot more clear once we do the demonstrations later on. And these individual pages you can think of as different displays that we can display to the user based on the logic inside of our router, but it's not like each one of these pages is an individual page on our website. And these names that we're giving the pages now are really just how we can, inside of the router, tell the router which page or display to send the user to based on the custom logic that we set up. So I've set up here a Pokemon page, and I've set up the All Pokemon page. So the last thing that I want to set up is the kind of Create Pokemon page. So I'm going to do that over here, and I'm going to click Add Page to Router, and I'm going to add in the Create Pokemon page. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add that in. And now that we've completed the setup of all of our router pages, what I'm going to do is head in and add in some design. It's going to be very simplistic. And once we do that, we can head into the backend and start creating the logic. So to understand the requests a little better, let's head over here to the documentation. And here we have all of the information that we can garner from a request to our router. And this request is essentially just somebody navigating to a specific URL, and they're requesting a resource that we have at that URL. And we can learn information both about the URL that they tried to navigate to and the user that was trying to navigate. So for example, I can get the base URL, okay, which will be the domain of our website usually. We can also get information about the path, which we're going to be using in our demo. And we can also get information about the user. For example, if they're a member of our website, and if so, what's their member ID. And this can help us create tailored experiences based on the person making the request. We're not going to be doing this in this tutorial, but this is a very classic use case for routers in terms of creating your own custom permissions and providing data specific to a specific user. So we're going to be focusing on how to get different information from the path, from the URL that they navigate to, and based on that, serving them different information. Okay, so we're back, and I've completed the setup of my individual router pages. So just to give you a brief overview, for the Pokemon page, I just put in a very large title where we're going to put the Pokemon's name, and I've put into text boxes for the height and the weight. So that's what we're going to display about an individual Pokemon. For the All Pokemon page, I set up just a repeater where we're going to display the Pokemon name and a button to click View, which will take us to one of the individual Pokemon pages. And for the last thing, I created this Create Pokemon page, which will show if the user tries to navigate to a URL of a Pokemon that doesn't exist. And what we'll do here is we'll dynamically populate this button to say, let's say, click here to create blank, and that's going to be the name of whatever they put in the URL. And that'll probably be more clear once I demonstrate it. We're obviously not going to do anything more than that at the moment in terms of creating the Pokemon because it's slightly beyond the scope of this tutorial, but just kind of conceptually to show how you can use this in a creative way. So once we set up these router pages, we're ready to head over to our code. So I'm going to go over here and go into backendrouters.js. And here in the code, we're going to start writing out this Pokemon router function. And before we do that, it's quite important to understand the concept of the request that comes in with the router. So in order to give you a better understanding of what this request is, what I'm going to do here is inside of our Pokemon router, I'm going to add a console log. So I'm going to say console.log, and I'm going to log the request. Okay, and then I'm just going to go ahead and publish our site. And once I've published our site, I'm going to go and make sure that I have our site logs open. So the backend site logs open, and I'm going to navigate to the Pokemon page of our website. So I'm going to go here and click View Site, and I'm going to go here to /Pokemon. So this, because it's a free Wix website, this is essentially our entire domain. And I'm going to go specifically to the router page which we set up, which will be /Pokemon as well. So an additional /Pokemon. I hope I didn't make it too confusing over here. And I'm just going to go and navigate to that page. And what we should see is this 500 error. Okay, so this means that there was some kind of error inside of our server, inside of our router function. And this makes sense because we haven't yet determined how we're going to send a response to requests from our server. And that's going to be the next big topic that we're going to talk about. But before we hop into that, let's just take a look here at our log. And we can see here that we got the request. Okay, so right over here, you can see the request being logged. And if I scroll down here, you can see essentially what kind of information comes in with the request. So we can see here the pages, so Pokemon page, all Pokemon page, create Pokemon page. Those are the pages that are under our router. We can see the URL that we navigated to, user agent, so information about the device that's kind of making the request. We have form factor, so I know if it's desktop or mobile, environment, etc. And we have the path, which is currently empty, okay? And that's because we didn't add anything in after our Pokemon. Okay, so if I was to go ahead for, let's say, navigate to /Pokemon /Charizard, and I might be spelling this wrong, most likely, but let's navigate to that page, and then we check out our logs, and we can see here this request that just came in, and we can see here that for the path, okay, so, oops, at least for the path, this inside of this array, you can see it says Charizard. Believe me that that's the path, and that's what we're going to be using essentially to direct people to specific pages of a specific Pokemon. So now that we hopefully have a slightly better understanding about what the request is, let's go ahead and talk about how we can craft our response. Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding about the request, let's take a look at the documentation and try and understand the response. So the response is essentially how the server or the router reacts to the request and what it provides to the user on the other end. So we have several different options for what it can provide, and for those coming from like a web dev background, these should sound rather familiar in terms of your typical responses to a server request. And Wix has kind of wrapped these in these functions of typical responses that you'd get to simplify that process essentially. So if we take a look here on the side, we can see that some of these functions belong to the responses. So for example, one response that we can have is OK. And this is the typical response if you want to provide the user with access to the page and with specific data. So this means, okay, we got the request, we understood it, we processed it, we have your data, here it is, and I want you to display a specific page. Okay, so when we use the OK response, we provide, if we take a look here on the side, so we provide a specific router page that we want to send them. Or send them to essentially. So it could be, let's say, our Pokemon page, it could be our all Pokemon page, could be create Pokemon page, and that can be determined by the logic in our router. In addition to just the page, we also have the option to send in some kind of data that we can then use inside of the Velo code on that page in order to populate the page with custom data based on the request. Okay, so that's the typical response, okay, and I'll be demonstrating that in a moment. Some other responses that you might want to be familiar with is, for example, not found. So for example, if they try to navigate to a specific URL inside the router that doesn't exist, so you can return not found. We don't have that resource. In my specific project, I'm choosing to handle that differently and send them to a specific page that's dedicated to not found. So I'm going to be sending an OK response, but if you want to just tell them this doesn't exist and that's all, like a typical 404, then that would be not found. You can also redirect them to a different URL. You can send them forbidden, so that means that they don't have access because it's a members only page and they're not a member or they're not the right type of member. So basically there are different responses that you can give and they'll either display specific error messages to the user or send them to specific router pages that you set up. Okay, so this is the Pokemon documentation, and I chose this because there's no need for authentication, so it'll be super easy for us to set this up. And I'm not going to go in depth about how this API works because it's really just for demonstrating how you can use external data inside of your router pages. So I'm just going to be using this endpoint over here, which when we call it, it'll give us just a list of 20 Pokemon. And this list will also include these individual URLs, which we can use to fetch additional information about each Pokemon. Okay, so what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to go and just copy this URL, and I'm going to head back into our editor. And inside of our routers.js file, what I'm going to do is I'm also going to write up here, I'm going to import fetch. I'm going to import fetch from Wix fetch. And then what I'm going to do here is as soon as we get a request, so I'm not going to log here request anymore because we understand what the request looks like already. But what I am going to do is I'm going to fetch the data from that URL. So I'm going to say here const, let's say Pokemon list equals to await, and we're going to need to turn our router into an asynchronous router now. So we'll just do async like that. Await, fetch, and I'm going to pass in the URL over here, which should get us the list of the Pokemon. And now what we're going to do is we're going to need to create different responses based on custom logic of what our path is. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get the path. So let's say const path equals to request. Okay, and the first step in my logic is going to be that if the path length is 0, so if you recall that path was an array, and it was 0 when we navigated to the just main router page of /Pokemon, and then it had additional items in the array when we navigated to like a sub page. So if the path length is 0, so if path dot length equals to 0, then what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to return the all Pokemons page. And with that page, I'm going to return the data of the Pokemon list. Okay, so I'm going to send in the whole entire Pokemon list. Okay, and the next situation we'll deal with in a moment, but let's go ahead and head over to our all Pokemon page and see how we can handle this data once it comes in. Okay, so let's try setting up a response inside of our project. So as you can see here up on top, when the routers.js file is created by Wix, it automatically imports a few of the responses that are used in its example. So if you're just using OK, not found, we'll talk about this one later on, but if you're just using those two, then you're good. If not, you'll have to import the other ones here like forbidden, etc., depending on what you need. And once you've imported them over here, then essentially what we have to do inside of our Pokemon router function is just to return the response that we want to return. So let's say OK, and here I need to pass in the page that we want to return. So let's say, for example, I'll return the all Pokemon page. Okay, and now that we've done that, I can go ahead and publish the site. And now, hopefully, if we try to navigate to any of the pages here, so if I try to navigate to this page, for example, then it should provide me with the All Pokemon page, okay? And even if I was to navigate to, for example, this URL, then it would still give the All Pokemon page. So anything that's under this router will return now this All Pokemon page. Obviously, that's not the behavior that we want. We want them to go to the All Pokemon page if they navigate to just /Pokemon, and we want them to go to an individual Pokemon page if they navigate to /Pokemon / a Pokemon name. And in order to set that up, we're going to need to start getting our data from the Pokemon API. So let's head over and do that. So in order to get the data about our Pokemons, once we land on the page, we're going to need to use this method from Wix window frontend. Okay, so this is a slightly different API, and essentially it's just calling Wix window frontend.getRouterData, and that will get the data that we passed along with the router response. So let's head over here into the editor, and here on the All Pokemon page, what I'm going to do is I'm going to import Wix window frontend. And then here inside of the onReady, I'm going to say const Pokemon list equals to Wix window frontend dot get router data. Okay, so now I have the Pokemon list. And what I'll do initially is I'll just put in here console.log, and I'll say here Pokemon list, just to make sure that we're getting the data as we expect. And then we'll hop in and deal with populating our repeater with the data. So let me go ahead and publish this. And now we can head over here to our site. So if, for example, I go to Pokemon /Charizard, then what we should get here is an error, okay? Because we're not handling that specific situation in our router. But if I go to the page with no path, okay, that's the logic that we implemented just now, then we should arrive at the All Pokemon page, unless we have some kind of other problem. So let me see what's happening here. Let's take a look. So this is the request that came in. To be honest, I already figured it out in my head, but I do want to show you what the problem is. And the issue is over here. So if we take a look at the path, so I misinterpreted this before. Okay, what you can see here is an empty string. So before I interpreted this as an empty array, but essentially it's not an empty array, it's an array with one item, which is an empty string. Okay, so we need to change the logic of our router. And instead of having it say that if the length of the path is 0, then we should route to the specific page. We should say that if the value of that item at path 0 is equal to an empty string, then we'll navigate to the new page. Okay, so let's go ahead and just fix up that logic real quick. So I'm going to head here to the routers.js, and here saying instead of if path.length equals 0, I'm going to say if path 0 equals to an empty string. Okay, so let's go ahead and publish that real quick and head back to our live site. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh this page. And hopefully, yeah, so we got the All Pokemon page. And if I switch this to Charizard, then we don't get any page yet. We're going to set that up later. So let's head back to the All Pokemon page. And I'm going to open up the console over here. And we can see here that we got an object. Okay, so this is the data that we got. And we can see here that we got back. Okay, so I'm seeing here, this is essentially the response that we got back from the API. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to parse this in order to get the body. So let's head back into the editor, and here inside the router.js file, we'll make a small change. So instead of saying that the Pokemon list is equal to this, we're going to say that this is the response from this request, And the Pokemon list itself is equal to await response.json. Okay, and I think that that should deal with our issue. So let's go ahead and publish that. And I'm going to go to this page and give it a refresh. And I'll do one more just, oh yeah, so there we go. I think that, now I got something in Spanish. Let me try one more time. There we go. Okay, great. So as you saw just now, and I'm not editing this out because this is all part of the experience, so I don't want you to think that like it's not working for you, and for me it works smoothly all the time. So when we're publishing the new router, sometimes it takes some time for Wix to kind of clear the cache and refresh all that stuff and everything. So make sure that you refresh a few times when you're making changes to your routers, because it can take some time for those to propagate. But either way, here we can see here now that we're getting the data that we wanted about the Pokemons. So here we have some kind of metadata about the request, and here we have the results. And we could refine the data that we're passing to the front end to only the results, because that's what we really need, but I'll leave that to you because it's not so important. So here inside of the results, this is essentially what we're going to use in order to populate our repeater. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to head here back to our site, and on the All Pokemons page, let's set up the logic for our repeater. So before we do that, let's just quickly name our repeater. So this is going to be the Pokemon repeater. And here we'll call this the Pokemon name. And this button we'll call the view button. Awesome. And now what we can do is we can set up here the on item ready for our repeater. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our Pokemon repeater, and I'm going to say .on item ready. And here we're going to have a few parameters. So we're going to have the item, and we're going to have item data. And again, this isn't a tutorial about repeaters. I have a bunch of tutorials on the topic if you want to check those out. But I'm assuming some basic knowledge of repeaters as I run through this. So let's select the item Pokemon name, and that will be equal to, so .text will be equal to the item data. I think it was .name. Let's just double check that over here. Yeah, item data.name. Okay, and in terms of the view button, okay, so the view button, so item view button dot on click, and I'll import Wix location up here. So import Wix location front end. And you can do this either by using Wix location front end. You can also just assign kind of a link to the specific button. You can go both ways. But here we're going to do Wix location frontend .to, and I'm going to navigate to slash Pokemon and slash, and here we're going to add in the item data .name. So that should essentially navigate to our domain slash Pokemon slash the name of that Pokemon. And once we have that, we can just assign the data from our Pokemon list to this repeater. So let me select the repeater, Pokemon repeater, dot data equals to Pokemon list. But we're going to need to do a slight manipulation to the data here to add a unique ID to each one of these items. And you can do that either using like UUID. What I'll do is I'll just transform, I'll just transform the name of the Pokemon into a unique ID, assuming that all the Pokemons have a unique name. So Pokemon list.map, and then for each Pokemon, I will say that we're going to return the Pokemon itself. Make sure you can see what I'm doing here. Pokemon and a unique ID, which is equal to the Pokemon dot ID, dot name, not ID. Okay, so I think that this should be good. So let's go ahead and publish. And I'm going to head over to our live site. And let's go ahead and give this a refresh. What did I do wrong? Dot map is not a function. Okay, I already know what I did wrong. So as we saw here inside of the Pokemon data, so the data has a subproperty of results, which is an array. So that's essentially the data that we want to pass into the repeater. So to fix that, all I'll have to do is go right over here and say Pokemon list dot results dot map. Okay, small fix, which we can go ahead and publish. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh. And just refresh one more time for good measure. And boom. Okay, so now we can see here that all of our Pokemon are being populated here in the repeater. And if I click view, then it will take me to a specific Pokemon page, which is currently not set up in our router, but that's the next thing that we're going to do is handle the situation where somebody navigates to a specific Pokemon. So for the individual Pokemon pages, we're going to take advantage of this endpoint in the Pokemon API, which allows us to fetch the Pokemon with ID or name. So let's go ahead and just grab this endpoint right over here. And I'm going to head back into our editor and specifically go to the routers.js page. And then right over here, what we'll do is that if the path is not equal to an empty string, so I'll add in here else if, or just else. Essentially, if it's not an empty string, then that's all the other situations we want to deal with. What we'll do is we'll fetch an individual Pokemon with the name that equals to the path. So I'm going to say here const name equals to path 0. And then we will say here const response equals to, and I'll fetch, and let me put our new endpoint over here. And instead of the ID or name over here, I'm going to dynamically insert the name of the Pokemon that we're trying to fetch. And then here I'll say const Pokemon data equals to, and let's not forget the await before we resolve these promises. So await here and await here as well, response.json. Okay, so this will be the data of the specific Pokemon. And what I want to do here, before I actually get the JSON of this response, I want to make sure that this response came back with a status of 200. Because if it didn't, then that means that we might not have a Pokemon by that name. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say if response.status equals to 200, then we're going to deal with this over here. And if we don't get a status of 200, so let me put in an else over here. If we don't get a status of 200, I'm going to return our create a Pokemon page. Okay, so that's going to indicate that we don't have a Pokemon by that name, and we're going to let the person create a new Pokemon. So let's return here OK, and I'm going to return the create Pokemon page. And in terms of the data that I'm going to return there, so I'm going to send over the name of the Pokemon that they were trying to create. We could send that in here. We could also just get directly from the URL, but let's do it through here. So I'm going to send in the, let's say, name, and we'll have path. We'll just send in the name like that. Okay. And here, if we do get back Pokemon data, so we did actually get a Pokemon, then we'll send that Pokemon data over. So let's do return, and we'll say OK. And we're going to pass in the Pokemon page. And we're going to pass over the Pokemon data. Okay, so that's essentially how we're going to be handling all situations. So if the path is equal to 0, if path 0 is an empty string, then what we created before, and if not, we'll send them to either the Pokemon's page or the Create a Pokemon page. I'm going to make a slight change here in the logic, and I'm going to change this so that instead of getting the list of all the Pokemon before we investigate what the path is, I'm going to do it here within this specific situation, because over here we don't make any use of that list essentially of Pokemons. So there's no real reason to fetch it beforehand, because it's just a useless fetch if we end up getting an individual Pokemon. So that's just a small change in logic over there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to publish this and just run some tests on the live site to make sure that we're handling all the situations correctly. So one small thing that I want us to do before we go to test is to log the data that we're getting on our Pokemon page and the Create Pokemon page when we navigate to them. So let's just do that quickly. So I'm going to import like we did before. So import Wix window front end. And then here within the page code, we can say const Pokemon data equals 2, and we're going to have Wix window frontend dot get router data, and then we can just log that here. So console.log Pokemon data. Okay, so that's for the Pokemon page. And then for the Create Pokemon page, we're going to do something very similar. So let's just go ahead and import Wix window frontend, and we're going to get the name. Okay, so const, let's call it Pokemon. I'll call it here Pokemon data as well. Pokemon data equals to Wix window frontend dot get router data, and let's console.log Pokemon data. So essentially the same thing. I could have just copy pasted, but I didn't. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and publish this. And let's head over to our live site. And I'm just going to give this a refresh. And I'm going to open up our console logs. And so first of all, our all Pokemon page is still working, which is awesome. And if I go ahead here to view a specific one, that we can see that we did navigate to the correct page, Bulbasaur, and this is a Pokemon that we know exists because it was in the list of all the Pokemons that we got from the API. We didn't deal with populating the data here yet, but if we take a look, and we can see here that we have all the data about Bulbasaur. So name Bulbasaur, and here I should have that here, the weight and the height, which we're going to be using on our individual Pokemon pages. Okay, so that's working. And now let's try and look for a Pokemon that doesn't exist. So let's say Bobby. I don't think that there's a Pokemon called Bobby. So let me try and go to /Pokemon/Bobby. And boom. So, oh no, that Pokemon doesn't exist. And we can see here that we got back the name Bobby. And we're going to be able to use that in order to populate the label here of the button. So let's go ahead and set up those final steps of our individual Pokemon pages and our Create a Pokemon page. Okay, so now to use the data on the individual pages, it's going to be pretty simple because we already did something more complicated with our repeater. But just to kind of complete the project from this perspective, let's go ahead and do that. So here we have the Pokemon data on the Pokemon page. And what I'll do is first thing I'll just name these elements. So I'll select this title over here, and I'll just call this Pokemon name. And I'll select this, and I'll call this Pokemon height. Pokemon height. And I'll select this and I'll call this Pokemon weight. Spelled that wrong, weight. And then what I'll do over here, inside of the page code, I'll select each of those elements. So let's select the Pokemon name, and I'll say .text equals to Pokemon data .name, and I'll select the Pokemon height, and we'll say .text. And here I'll add like a little more information. So let's make this a template literal, and I'll say here height, and here I'll add in the data, which is the Pokemon data dot height. Okay, and let's do the last Pokemon weight. So select here Pokemon weight, and this is going to be dot text equals to, and the same thing, but just with weight. So weight, and we're going to have here Pokemon data dot weight. Awesome. So that should be good for this page. And for our other page, which is the create, right over here. So create Pokemon page. Let me select that. And right over here, what we'll do is this will have essentially the name of the Pokemon here in the Pokemon data. So let me just give this button a name. So I'll call this create button. And then over here, I'll just select it in the code. So create button dot label equals to, and let's say click here to create, and then we'll put in the Pokemon's name. So we'll have here Pokemon data dot name. Okay, so let's go ahead and publish this. And we'll just confirm these final changes here. So let me refresh this page. And it says click here to, I'm assuming it's going to say create Bobby. I kind of have a little sizing mistake there. Let's make this button a little bigger. Boom. Publish. And refresh. Refresh again. Here, click here to create Bobby. Okay, and then you can kind of take them to a page which creates a new Pokemon or something. I don't know. But basically, that's the idea over there. And if we go to our All Pokemon page and we go to, let's say, Venusaur, then here we see Venusaur and we see the height and we see the weight, and you can go ahead and add in other data from the API as well. So now that we've finished with that basic implementation of providing specific logic inside of our router and returning a response based on the request and how to use that data on the individual router pages in order to create a unique UI. So we've done all that. Now I want to talk a little bit about how to use or how to set up the SEO within your Wix router. So there are two aspects of SEO that we need to deal with in terms of Wix router. The first one is the individual page SEO, and that's like the meta tags, what you can see over here. So title, description, etc., everything about a specific page that we're passing. And since this data is dynamic and possibly coming from a third party, then we'll need to essentially tell Wix via the router itself what these meta tags should be. So that's one aspect of SEO that we're going to need to set up. The other aspect is the sitemap. So the sitemap is essentially how search engines know what URLs are included in your website and what the basic contents of those URLs are. And since the Wix router can be very dynamic and can have essentially many URLs that are associated with it based on the dynamic data that we're populating it with, we need to tell Wix and essentially these search engines what URLs to include in our sitemap. And that's done here via the myRouter sitemap function. So let's head in and first deal with how to pass in the meta tags. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to use this boilerplate that we have over here inside of the Wix documentation. So I'm going to just copy this right over here and show you where we would implement that inside of our project. Okay, so slight rewind. Luckily, I headed over to the actual API reference just to check the documentation. And it seems like the example that they provide over here is actually a deprecated version, Wix. But luckily, I checked and I see here, so you see here title, description, this is all deprecated. But they do have an example of the new way to do it, which is essentially by passing in these meta tags. So if we take a look over here, scroll down a bit. So over here on the side, you can see kind of like an updated version of the head options. So we're going to pass in the title, and we're going to pass in an array of the meta tags, which has the name of the meta tag and the actual content of the meta tag. And this is a little more dynamic, so it allows you to add a variety of meta tags that you might want to add, including the option to tell it to no index. Okay, so not to index a specific page. So let's go ahead and see kind of how we would add this into our site. I'm not going to deal here with links or structured data. If you want, you can read a little bit more about that. But I will add in the head options with the title and the meta tags. Let me just grab that over here. And that is what I'm going to copy and head over to our site code with. Okay, so here back in our routers.js file, we essentially have several different situations that need a different SEO approach. So we have one situation where we're sending them to a page with the list of all the Pokemon. So that's going to be that's going to have a certain set of SEO headers and meta tags. And we have the situation where we send them to a specific Pokemon. So that's going to be a different set of meta tags. And we also have the situation where we send them to create Pokemon page, where we may not want to index that page at all because it's essentially a Pokemon that doesn't exist yet. So let's paste in the SEO boilerplate code that I copied over right over here. And we're going to need to just make sure to close these head options. And let's see how we can essentially customize this to our situation. So here for title, instead of a page title, we're going to have, for example, let's say all Pokemon. And then for the meta tags, so we don't want to have this robots no index, for example, so we can get rid of that. And in terms of the name, so for the page description, we can add in here, let's say, all the Pokemons you need, etc. And I'm not going to go through all of these and actually adjust them because I don't think you want to sit here and watch me go through it. But basically, the idea is that you can add in all the meta tags that you want here inside of an array, and you can remove them. And this isn't a SEO tutorial per se, so if you need to do a little research and understand some of these SEO terms, then you can go ahead and do that. And by this time, I think I have released an SEO tutorial. I'm kind of losing track because everything is scheduled ahead now, but I think that there should be an SEO tutorial on the channel by the time this comes out. So yeah, this is kind of how we would set up the head options, and then we would just pass it over here along with the Pokemon list. So we'd pass in here, so head options, along with, inside of the OK response, along with the page and the data. So it would be the last parameter here, essentially, in the OK method. And then we can essentially do the same thing over here. So for example, if we get a specific Pokemon and the response is 200, then we can set up over here, we can set up SEO data, SEO for Pokemon. So for that specific Pokemon, and we can pass that data here into the OK. And we can do the same thing, for example, if there isn't a Pokemon, and we can tell it, for example, no index. So we don't want to index this page on search engines. Okay, so that is how to set up the SEO for the individual router pages and situations. And now let's head in and talk a little bit about the sitemap and how we can set that up for our router. So in order to set up the sitemap for our router, essentially what we're going to want to do is to discover all of the possible URLs that might need to be added to the sitemap based on the dynamic data that we're adding in. So if we have kind of all our data hard-coded, like Wix has it here in this example, then they can just take that data and map through it. For us, we're going to need to essentially fetch the list of the Pokemons and map through that. Obviously, we're not going to try and retrieve every single Pokemon in the world in order to create this sitemap, but we're going to, for our example, just use that list of 20 Pokemons that we added to our All Pokemons page. But ideally, you would want to add all of the possible URLs that could be included through your router that you want indexed on Google. So let's follow through with this example that Wix provides. So first of all, we're going to need to get the data, and we're going to map that data into Wix router sitemap entries. Okay, and we're going to assign it to a variable called sitemap entries, which we're going to return as a promise. So let me just copy this line over here because this is our final goal of what we want to return. And I'm going to head over here into the editor, and I'm going to add that right over here. And we don't have the sitemap entries yet. In order to create our sitemap entries, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to grab these two lines over here. So essentially the code that gets our Pokemon list. And I'm just going to paste that right over here. Okay. And now what we can do is we can create these sitemap entries by saying const sitemap entries equals to, and we're going to map our Pokemon list just like Wix mapped their own data. So let's say Pokemon list dot map, and here I'll say for each Pokemon, essentially we're going to create a new sitemap entry, and in the end we're going to return that sitemap entry. Yeah. So let's say const sitemap entry equals to new sitemap Wix router sitemap entry. And here we're going to have, let's say, just the Pokemon. So just to remind you, that our Pokemon list, within the list, we wanted to use the results, okay, because that's essentially the list of the Pokemon. So that's the mistake that I made earlier on the page itself. So good thing I remembered here. And once we get those Pokemon, we can essentially pass in the Pokemon dot name to create a new sitemap entry. And then once we have this sitemap entry, we can essentially assign specific values to the various properties of the sitemap entry. So within a sitemap entry, for example, if we take a look here at the example Wix provided, so we're going to have the page name. Okay, so this page is the router page that is associated with that entry. So since this is a list of all of our individual Pokemons, essentially what we'll want to do is we'll want to have this entry.page name. So let me go over here back to our site. So here we have, they called it entry, I called it sitemap entry. So sitemap entry dot page name should be equal to, and this is going to be the Pokemon page. And notice what we're doing here is we're setting up the sitemap values for those individual Pokemon pages. But outside of this map, we'll also want to add in, for example, one sitemap entry just for the all Pokemon page, for example. But since that's less complex, because I'm just going to show you an example of how to do the dynamic data. So we have here the page name, and except for that, we'll also want to have the URL. Okay, so for that, it's going to be /Pokemon/ also the Pokemon name. So very similar to what they have here. So sitemap entry dot URL equals to, and here it's going to be slash Pokemon slash, and we'll add in here the Pokemon dot name. Okay, and if we check out over here, what else do we need? So we need the title. So for this, let's say I can add in the name as well. So let me go over here and sitemap entry dot title equals 2, and we'll have here also Pokemon dot name, and you can add in also here, let's say Pokemon Pokemon space plus. Okay, so that is essentially how we would set up the sitemap for dynamic data. Okay, so if we have kind of a list and we need to set up multiple sitemap entries for that entire list, so you'd want to go and do something like this. If your router is not that complex and it just has a few individual pages, then you can also just create individual map entries for each one and assign these properties for that specific sitemap entry. So we're going to wrap up here for today. Wix routers is a really big topic. There are some aspects that we didn't touch on, but I do hope that this tutorial was enough to give you a general understanding and touch on really the key and fundamental points that you need to address when you're setting up your Wix router. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give a thumbs up, and that will indicate that we should make more Wix router content. If you have any questions or want to share how you're using Wix router in your projects, then you can please leave them in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this about Wix, WebDev, Velo, etc., please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.